Hello, my name is Vicente Valentim, and I have the honor of being the recipient of the 2022 Klingemann Prize for my paper, Parliamentary Representation and the Normalization of Radical Right Support. In this video, I will give you a brief summary of the paper, but before that, I would like to thank the prize committee for choosing my work for this award, for which I'm very humble. The main point of this paper is to show that once radical right actors are represented in Parliament, their supporters feel more comfortable showing their views. The motivation for this paper and for most of my work is to try and understand what drives political behavior in general and extremist behavior in particular. And I am especially motivated by the increase in displays of extremist and anti-democratic preferences that we have seen in a number of Western democracies. And what I try to do is to show that these increases in extremist behavior are at least partially brought about by individuals who had long held these views. And what happens is that these individuals now feel that their views have become more acceptable, which makes them more comfortable acting on them. But it is not necessarily the case that their views have actually changed. In this paper specifically, I look into how social norms against radical right support weaken and thus make individuals who already supported radical right parties feel more comfortable acting on that support. And what I do in the paper is to propose a novel measure for the level of stigmatization of public support for political candidates, which basically captures the proportion of the official vote for a given party that is reported in post-electoral surveys. And then I use a number of different complementary empirical tests, which show that once radical right parties are in parliament, individuals become significantly more likely to admit having voted for them. I will start with my main theoretical argument, which is focused on this social psychological concept of social norm. Following Cristina Bicchieri, I define a social norm as a behavioral rule that is followed by individuals on condition that sufficiently many others follow it, believe it should be followed, and are willing to sanction those who deviate. And this concept is, I think, crucial to understand public displays of support for radical right politicians, because these politicians breach a number of established social norms, for example, those against the derogatory treatment of minority groups. And for this reason, their supporters have an incentive to falsify their preferences, meaning that they are likely not to publicly say what they think in private so as to avoid social sanctions by others. Now, what I'm arguing here, based on social psychological research, is that this situation is likely to change once the radical right enters parliament. And this is so for two reasons. On the one hand, elections represent an information update which can make individuals perceive that a larger than expected number of individuals in their society actually supports the radical right. And on the other hand, institutions tend to signal which behaviors and beliefs are acceptable in the society. And for this reason, once radical right actors are represented in parliament, individuals are likely to perceive that their views have become legitimized. Now, as I said, the problem with testing this argument with resource to observational data is that one basically needs to distinguish between two sorts of individuals. Individuals who support the radical right but do not disclose their preferences because they fear being judged by others, and individuals who simply do not support the radical right. And I tackle this issue by building a novel measure of how socially acceptable it is to support the radical right. This measure, as I said, is based on the proportion of the official vote for radical right parties that is reported in post-electoral surveys. And as you can see from the table and the figure in this slide, when one compares the vote share for radical right parties in post-electoral surveys to their official vote share, it is clear that they are significantly underreported. And this is something that does not happen with parties of other ideological families. Now, this is likely driven by social pressure not to report having voted for the radical right, because a survey interview is still a social interaction, and respondents are likely to feel judged by the interviewer and hence try to provide what they think is the socially desirable answer. So following this logic, what I'm arguing here is that since voting is private, social pressures are not likely to influence it as much. And as such, the official vote share for a party can be taken as a measure of its actual support, absent social pressures. And in turn, the vote share for the same party, as reported in post-electoral surveys, provides a measure of how many individuals are willing to tell someone else that they support this party in conditions of social pressure not to report radical right support. And the proportion of the two can be taken as a measure of the social acceptability of the party, which will basically be the dependent variable in the analysis of this paper. Now, to test the hypothesis that this proportion increases once radical right parties enter parliament, I run a fuzzy regression discontinuity design that takes advantage of exogenous variation induced by legally fixed electoral thresholds to parliamentary representation. The unit of analysis here is the party, and the forcing variable is the difference between each party's vote share and the electoral threshold, which means that the variable basically captures how far below or above the electoral threshold each party is. As a source of data, I rely on official data and on the surveys included in the comparative study of electoral systems, which provides high quality and comparable post-electoral surveys. So the sample will basically consist of all elections with an electoral threshold in place that were included in the CSES and for which at least one radical right party ran. And in this slide, you can see the main findings. As you can see, there is indeed a discontinuity around the electoral threshold, such that radical right parties that are just above these thresholds are significantly less underreported in post-electoral surveys than radical right parties that are just below. And I estimate this difference to be such that for each 10 individuals that voted for a radical right party, 4 to 5 more were willing to tell the interviewer that they had done so if the party narrowly entered parliament than if it narrowly failed to do so. Now, of course, these analyses are at the party level, but the argument of the paper takes place at the individual level. So one might wonder whether the results actually hold at this individual level. And to make up for the fact that I cannot really test that with the data that I'm showing you on this slide, I came up with a way how one can approximate this analysis at the individual level. And the idea is to look into some post-electoral surveys also included in the CSES that use different interview modes on different respondents. Some were interviewed in ways that kept their answers private, such as mailbag and internet modes, while others had to convey their answer to an interviewer, such as face-to-face and telephone interviews. And the idea is that this generates some variation in the level of pressure not to report radical right support. So what I do here is to use respondents interviewed in more private modes of interview as a sort of a control group who is more likely to reveal the preferences that they have in private. And then I regress a variable that asks respondents how much they like each party on each respondent's interview mode, private or public, whether the party is radical right or not, whether the party is in parliament or not, and the two-way and three-way interactions between these variables. And as you can see from the plot in this slide, all variables have the expected effect. Individuals report to like radical right parties less than the remaining parties. They report to like parties which are in parliament more, and they report to like parties more when the mode of interview is private. But the difference between how much individuals report liking a party in private and public modes of interviews is reduced when the party makes it to parliament, and this reduction is even larger in the case of radical right parties, which again supports this normalization effect of parliamentary entry. In fact, when radical right parties are in parliament, individuals actually report liking them more in public modes of interviews than in private ones, which is the opposite of what happens when they are out of parliament. Now, there is still one element of the argument that neither the aggregate level analysis nor this individual level analysis can speak to. And this is that the argument is to some extent dynamic. The idea is that the same party will be stigmatized before it enters parliament, but if it does enter parliament, it will become normalized. And both the party level analysis and the individual level analysis that I have shown so far are rather static. So to test for this dynamic element of the argument, I look into the case of one radical right party that ran for several elections before making it to parliament, which is the UK Independence Party. And here I use the same dependent variable as in the aggregate analysis that I showed in the beginning, which again represents the proportion of the official vote for the party that is reported in post-electoral surveys. The only difference here is that instead of using data from the CSES, I rely on data from the British election study. And then I run standard difference in differences models that compare the evolution of this variable for UKIP to that of the remaining of the mainstream parties in the country. And as you can see from the plots in this slide, the results again show that the vote share for UKIP was significantly less underreported after it made it to Parliament in 2015. And the effect size is around 20 percentage points, which means that for each 10 individuals that voted for UKIP, 2 more were willing to tell the interviewer that they had done so after the party entered Parliament. So to conclude, I used a number of different complementary empirical approaches which show that after entering Parliament, radical right actors become normalized, which means that individuals feel more comfortable publicly expressing support for them. And I think this has 2 main implications for the literature. In the first place, there's a number of recent studies that have reported interventions that change individuals' behavior without changing their attitudes. And in shifting the focus from attitudes to social norms, I think this paper highlights normative change as one path through which behavioral change can happen without attitudinal change, which I think might explain these findings. In the second place, I think the results I showed in this video suggest that increasing support for extremist and anti-democratic political platforms may not just be a product of individuals becoming more extremist or anti-democratic. They may also be driven by changes in the perceived acceptability of supporting radical right platforms. So these are the main takeaways from the paper. I would like to thank the committee again for choosing my work for this prize. I am very humbled. Thank you very much.